Hi, my name's Ian Wallace. I call myself the Messed Up Counsellor, which is quite an intriguing name. And the podcast you're about to see is one of many, and we've been doing about a year now. So you can look back and see all the things we've talked about with guests and on my own over the process. A lot of the information I use in the podcast initially came from the first book I wrote in 2011. Why do we do that? What do we do about it? And that came out and was the basis of all my learning, understanding at that time, which is going back a few years now. And that process of understanding how the world works for people, how we can alter, change, and adapt it, was kind of what it was there to do with the initial stages. I've made that now an audiobook as well, so it's available on Amazon as an audio file that you can check out and you can download to your heart's content, and hopefully that will be helpful. In the podcasts, we're trying to look at all sorts of things about human interactions, human dynamics, the world, and how we might understand it more or change it more. So it gives you lots of ideas and tools in order to think about and look at different ways of being or dealing with things. And hopefully that brings people together and makes people more able to connect and communicate. Lots of topics. If you ever want to connect to me, just obviously drop me a comment on the podcast and I shall try as much as possible to reply. And if you've got any ideas of things that we might want to use on the podcasts, then please let me know. My name's Ian Wallace. Thanks for looking and thanks for... Hi, welcome to another interesting, hopefully, podcast from Ian Wallace, the Messed Up Counsellor. And this Monday morning at 7 o'clock, if you're listening to me when it goes live, good morning and have a great day. So today what I'm looking at is breaking down the communication bubble. A lot of what I do is about communication, quite naturally, and communication that goes wrong. And sometimes people in any kind of relationship, not necessarily just an intimate one, they have, if we choose the person we're connecting to, we're usually very different characters. We're usually not the same. So how we see the world, how we work the world will be different. We might have some things in common, hobbies, interests, politics, whatever. But how we communicate will be different. And so that two people who are trying to communicate use me and people like me as kind of mediators, interpreters, to understand each other's language, basically. And so we're in the middle of that. In some sense, we're watching one person's language and another person's language, certainly when we're looking at working with couples or family members. And in the room, when I'm looking at that dialogue that's going on between two people and why it doesn't work, which is usually why they're seeing people like myself, something's going wrong or something isn't happening, or they just want it to get better, whatever that might look like. The person that's talking and verbalizing and sharing whatever their ideas, thoughts, processes are, they will be communicating with the other person in the room, and the other person will be picking up that information, obviously, through their ears and their eyes, and they'll be then answering or interacting with it. Now, what sometimes goes wrong is that the person who is communicating is very lucid, very kind of verbalizing very quickly, can get their thoughts out in words and very easily. And maybe the other person can't. Now, person A, who can get the words out, we'll use that terminology and make it easier, is kind of saying to themselves, well, I've given you all this information, I need an answer, you're not answering, what's going on? But person B communicates differently. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to understand each other's communication process. But they can't do that because a lot of our communication goes on in our head. We think an awful lot, which we don't necessarily always say. So there's a lot more thinking than saying. So the person B who is trying to formulate a reply is getting person A very frustrated sometimes, because that reply is not coming quickly enough, or or it's not formulated enough, or it doesn't give exactly what they were asking. So when we break that down and we kind of slow it down and we look at both people and how their worlds work, then that's going to usually be massively different. But neither one at the moment understands each other's world. So it's my job and people like me to kind of break that down and try and understand what the heck's going on. And so when we kind of identify that, we can say to the B person, okay, so when you're looking for an answer, when you're looking to reply, what is going on? What are you doing? How is that working for you? And more often than not, the person will be thinking an awful lot, but not saying an awful lot. And that's interesting, because a lot of the time the thinking is about trying to find the words or the phrases or the structures to reply in our heads. We're thinking and then talking. But if somebody's come from a background whereby they have this criticism process in their growing up years, as I've talked about many times in the podcasts, then that thinking process and criticism disrupts that natural flow of information. Think of it that they might be intimidated or they might be insecure in their processes. So they're formulating or trying to formulate the answer, in some sense trying to think how the other person A is going to receive that answer, and then what they may react with that answer. So there's an awful lot going on in person B, in their mind, in their head, that is not being seen or understood usually. And that person is working really, really hard to try and get the right words or the right phrases or the right answer that might not upset A, because that might be part of the reason for formulating a long process of thinking, or they haven't got the language to explore it or explain it. And if that's the case, person A wouldn't understand that. They don't break it down to that level. They would maybe have an idea of that, but they wouldn't know what's going on in person B's mind and how they formulate their world. So when we break it down and we slow it all down and we kind of put it into this suspension of things and talk about one sentence. For example, this last week, I had a couple in the room and this was going on, which is why I've brought it in today for the podcast. And the person A was getting very frustrated and thinking, not knowing, but thinking that person B was being disruptive or being kind of not helping or some power play control thing going off. And they were sat there fuming in a sense inside, not externally, but inside. And I picked this up in the room. And so I said to person B, well, what is going on? And that's exactly what was happening. They were really trying to think about how not to offend person A or upset them. So they were trying to choose the language that fitted that. And the motivation was not to upset person A. So the motivation is okay, it's good, there's nothing wrong with that. Person A didn't understand that. They were aware of that. And so by slowing it down, by looking at that connection between thinking and talking, we were able to kind of construct better communication processes, because the more frustrated person A got, the more faster and the less time they gave for person B to interact, because they wanted an answer. So they were doing faster and faster and faster. And obviously person B was withdrawing from this process because there was so much information coming through and they couldn't really understand it and they couldn't get a sense of it. So they closed down, they shut down. So then person A thought, without actually asking the question of person B, that they were being rejected. And that's a massive thing for human beings, feeling rejected. It's one of the major drives for us that kind of creates a lot of uncertainty and a lot of internalized emotions that are usually negative. And so by breaking it down, by bringing it to awareness, person B was able to see that they were the problem. This was just their style of communication, and they were doing it for the right reasons, not to upset person A, but person A didn't understand that at the time. So they were quite naturally feeling rejected, feeling frustrated, feeling as though the person B wasn't going to answer them or give them the input they needed. Now, in a normal conversation without any kind of emotional trauma, that probably would get overlooked, to be fair, because we hear things, but we then change it in our mind to what it is. If you've ever done Chinese whispers, you start with one phrase, short phrase, and you end up 4 or 5 people down the line and it's completely different. Because our mind inputs that and then transfers it into something that we either take a guess at if we haven't heard it fully, or we kind of move it around and change it and alter it, which creates a massive confusion and disruption to the two parties talking. So when we're looking at communication, we just take it as being, well, that's what we do. I'm talking, you're listening, you should be hearing what I'm talking about. It's not necessarily true. So when we're looking at communication in the counselling room, what we do is we break it down, we slow it down, we give it understanding and awareness of what's really going on for that person. Because in the example of A and B, B's brain is working really, really, really hard to try to find the right words in the right way to reply. They're not sat there doing nothing. Now, person A thinks they are. They're ignoring them maybe. But person B's brain is really, really working hard, and that takes an awful lot of energy. If you can imagine, everything that goes through your mind, my mind, is energy. We're using energy to do our thoughts. We're using energy to speak these words. And that energy isn't limitless. We get tired. We need fuel. We need things to keep that energy going. We don't think about these kind of things in minute detail sometimes. We just see the reaction. We then work out, without asking, without talking, we work out what that means to us, and then we use that as the reality, which is not necessarily true. And so when we get these things happening in the room, and communication is probably the main thing we work on to start with, or getting communication working, or making more structured communication, more understood communication. That is one of the first jobs we usually encounter when we're doing any kind of couple or family work. Something is not communicating well. But everybody just assumes that that's the way we do it. Assumptions are not helpful. We assume an awful lot by our mind, our thoughts, our historical data. So if somebody grows up in a household, for example, where it's very boisterous and there's a lot of noise, a lot of people, you kind of have to shout to get heard, that's going to be their normal way of communicating. To get heard, I raise my voice. To get heard, I become more assertive. That's normal. If they then get in a relationship with, or a friendship with somebody who comes from a very quiet household, that might be perceived as conflict. It might be perceived as an argument. It might be perceived as having a go because the voice is raised. Now, that is normal to understand those things without awareness and understanding and reflection. So each one could assume, wrongly, that the other person is doing something to hurt them or harm them or reject them or those kind of things, which is not true. So when we look at communication, when we break it down, we look at individuals and how they're communicating, then it's a really good idea not to take the defensive, but to ask the questions. Ask the other person, what is it that's going on for you at the moment? Why is this working this way? What are you doing in your thoughts? And how can I help you to make those thoughts easier, better, more constructive? We can't get into somebody's head. We can't read people's minds. We always expect them to. You should know. Countless times with couples I've heard, you should know what I want, you should know what I'm doing, you should. We've been together 20 odd years or whatever. Nobody can. We can make a best guess, but that best guess will be wrong. It will not be correct. And we have to take that as being a fact, because unless we ask the other person what it is they're feeling, thinking, what they're going through, we can never ever know it. We can best guess it, we can assume it, we can do some kind of thought process based on our historical data to understand where we are today, but it will never be correct. And when we're feeling threatened, when we're feeling defensive, I don't mean threatened physically, emotionally, if there's some kind of conflict going on, we will normally go into protective mode. So we see more and more of the interactive process as being negative or aimed at us, or some kind of conflict process, disruption process. So we go into that defensive mode. And when we go into the defensive mode, our mind changes things. It hears what it wants to hear. It doesn't hear everything. It picks up the things it wants to pick up, dependent on the situation. And that's where this thing goes wrong with communication, because then we're not necessarily understanding what it is the other person's doing. So if communication is not working for anybody with any relationship, the first thing to do is to be aware of that. We can't change anything unless we're aware of something. Then, with the person you're communicating with, stop. Because if you keep on doing what you've been doing, you're going to get what you've always got. It's the law of the universe. If you always do what you've always done, you always get what you've always got, basically. So stop communicating. Don't be defensive. Start being interested, curious, asking of the other person what's going on for them. And as long as they can answer you truthfully, it might not be quick with the answers. Sometimes it takes people a long time to understand how they're processing their world. And so don't expect an immediate answer. If they have to think about something and break something down as to what they're doing. But hopefully, by doing that, you will then start to reconnect with interest, with connection, with caring, with all those kind of nice feelings and emotions that go with that. And we can get a better understanding of the other person. So if it ain't working, don't keep doing it. Simple, really, isn't it? Break it down. Build a solution-focused process between the two people, not being defensive, but being inquiring and curious. And then once you become aware of why that person is doing what they're doing, then go back into it and try and do it differently. Hopefully that's made sense and it's given you some things to think about. And if you like these podcasts, please like, share, tell your friends about it, tell your families about it, because you never know what somebody's going through. We can never read somebody else's mind, as I've said. And they may get some benefit from it. They may not, but they may do. And you've given somebody a possibility of more awareness and understanding. My name's Ian Wallace. I'm the Messed Up Counsellor. Take care. Hi, thanks for listening to the podcast, and hopefully it made sense and was interesting for you. Please subscribe, like, and share. With the podcasts, you never know who will be helped by the things we talk about, things we share. We don't normally tell people our problems, but by sharing it and helping other people to understand things. The book Insecurity, It's All About Me, is also available now through Amazon. And it gives you an understanding of what drives insecurity, how insecurity works within our human dynamics, and how you can get a much more secure connection with people. It gives you lots of ideas and thoughts, which is really good. So thanks for listening. Subscribe, like, share, hit the button. And if you've got any comments, please give me them and I'll do my best to answer them. Thanks very much. Take care.